Goodness, being love effectively, can embrace evil, but evil, being effectively hatred, cannot embrace good. So good is greater than evil. Good can embrace, take into itself, and transform what is in its nature at the time evil, and turn it into something greater. But evil can never do this to good.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to most of you back to the second of our Sophia Lectures series with Dr. Iain McGilchrist. I'm Stephen Blackwood. I'm the president of Ralston College, a new college here in Savannah, Georgia, that seeks to revive and reinvent the university. We seek to emulate the greatest universities in history through our wholehearted pursuit of truth, the freedom on which that pursuit depends, freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, freedom of association, beauty in all of its forms, and the friendship that enables us to seek those things together. The Sophia Lectures aim to address those very fundamental commitments in the context of contemporary life by inviting one of the boldest and brightest minds to think through with us our contemporary world in light of perennial and fundamental questions. By way of introduction tonight to our speaker, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, I'd like to share with you briefly a story that I've had the privilege of hearing from him. He's chuckling over here, I think a bit worried about what's coming. This is a story that has moved me very, very deeply, and it dates from the period in Dr. McGilchrist's life that he describes. Keep in mind, he has had an educational trajectory at the finest institutions in the English-speaking world, many of them, at the times at which he was there, as good as any educational institution can ever be. The institution he regards, without any question, when I asked him, as having the greatest formation in his life, the most formative period of his life, was Winchester College. Now, it's called a college, but that can mislead us into thinking it was at the post-secondary higher educational level. This was when Iain was 12 years old. He went to Winchester College, at which point it had about a little over, I think, 600 to 650 years of history. When I asked him what were some of the moments you remember from the classroom that were most inspiring, and he said, well, when you add in the classroom, it doesn't quite work because so many of the moments that were most formative for me happened outside of the classroom. And one of them was that they were playing a sport with a ball, and Winchester has a very tall chapel. And the ball ended up getting booted up on top of this chapel, which, to many of us would look more like a cathedral. Keep in mind, it's a 14th century, beautiful structure. And Iain, perhaps this gives us a sense of the daring intellectual adventure that he was on. Iain climbed up the chapel to the top to rescue this ball. But he was found out, and even at Winchester, which was a place that cultivated adventure, you were not exactly supposed to be climbing up on top of the roof of this medieval structure. In any event, the housemaster, I think it was, said to him, Iain, you're going to have to do a task for me. It's kind of a punishment, let's call it. And the task that was assigned to him, he said, I'd like you to write me a comparison of John Donne's At the Round Earth's Imagined Corners and Gerard Manley Hopkins's Carrion Comfort. No, I'll not carrion comfort despair, not feast on thee. So it begins. Many of you may know these sonnets. Young Iain retired dutifully to his rooms to think about what these two things had in common. Not much, he thought, as he looked at it initially. But as he tells the story, around 3 a.m, the lights began to come on, and he began to think that, in fact, these things really had something to say to each other. Now, of course, so much to think about in this story, not only about the character of an institution that can cultivate the talent of young Iain McGilchrist, but also what Iain today can show to us about what those institutions that wish to cultivate such talent need to be like. It's deeply moving to me that the so-called punishment or redressing of this so-called violation of college policy was in fact to give a young teenage boy a task that drove him to even further heights intellectually. What do these unlike things have to do with each other? Iain's teacher once asked him. That, I think, is a way into understanding not only what education is at its best, but what Iain McGilchrist's vocation was then and has been and remains today. That through his extraordinary explorations of philosophy, literature, myth, theology, music, art, biology, physics, neuroscience, mathematics, poetry, he is able to help us to see that in each of these there is a whole greater than the parts. Join me in welcoming Dr. McGilchrist for his second Sophia Lecture.
Thank you again for your very kind introduction. I thought actually that Bach was a very important introduction because Bach, division and union, Bach, asymmetry and symmetry, Bach, finitude and infinity. And so that was a perfect metaphor for everything I'm trying to say. And one of the things I'm trying to say is that things and their opposites, things that we don't see are comparable or can be combined, need to be so combined or not disjoined because they already exist together. And so some of the things I want to say sound a little bit paradoxical. For example, yesterday I was talking about creativity, and I was saying that two important elements in creativity are things that probably most people wouldn't think of straight off the top of their head. One being necessary distance, and another being necessary resistance. So the things that we think of as purely negative may in fact be powerfully creative. And the flip side of that is some of the things that we think are so marvelous, we could do with less of rather than necessarily more and more of. So it's a matter of getting a balance, but not just a flaccid balance, the tension between giving as much credence as possible to these two opposites at the same time. In other words, to give a homely metaphor, if you want to make a really good apple pie, and I believe I'm in the home of, really good apple pie, and last night I had a wonderful thing that was called a biscuit. I would call it a scone, but it was quite the best one I'd ever eaten in my life. Anyway, in this home of apple pie, mother's apple pie, you want to make a really good apple pie, you don't want bland apples, you want tart apples and good honey. So you need to be able to push these two things, and the harmony between them is what gives rise to the beauty of eating a good apple pie. In 1971, Heisenberg wrote, "The same organizing forces that have shaped nature in all her forms are also responsible for the structure of our minds." And a lot of what I was saying yesterday related to this fact that the structures of existence, and certainly the structures of life, and the structures of the central nervous system share important qualities. And I suggest that they mirror in certain ways one another. And it's probably the wrong question to ask which came first, because in the real world, it isn't set up like a machine. Things come into being together and co-create. Now, we've been taught to imagine a universe in which the natural state is stasis until things are set in motion by some external force, in which parts are independent, though we can connect them, and sequences are composed of discrete elements, where all can be made explicit, and leaving things implicit is a kind of laziness or missed opportunity, where truth is literal and metaphors a species of lie, where the natural state is randomness and order a rare and unnatural intrusion on a state of chaos, simplicity the norm until worked up into complexity, where all is determinate if only we had full knowledge, where curves represent a departure from and a disturbance in straight lines, which are fundamental, and symmetry, the norm, until otherwise disturbed. I argue we are closer to reality when we see things exactly the other way about. So I suggest that there are what I call limit cases. What do I mean? What I mean is, instead of there being an absolute at one end of the scale that is approached as much as possible from the opposite end of that scale, we should see it the other way around. So stasis, rather than being the universal condition until disturbed, is the limit case of motion, which is in fact universal in everything that exists. Total independence, if it ever could exist, would be the limit case of interdependence. The discontinuous is the limit case of the continuous, if again it could ever be achieved. The explicit, the limit case of the implicit. The literal, the limit case of metaphorical. Randomness, merely the limit case of order, which is universal. Simplicity, a special case of complexity. Determinacy, the limit case of indeterminacy. Straight lines, the limit case of curves. And symmetry, the limit case of asymmetry. Why do we think otherwise? Because we attribute to reality the features of the left hemisphere's mode of apprehension. So what actually is the nature of symmetry? We intuitively understand the concept, and it has great beauty of its own. This is Abington Park, just a few miles outside of Winchester, close enough if you had a car to get in it and go to a very nice pub nearby. Symmetry literally means equal measure, symmetria. And I would argue both terms, equal and measure, are typical of the left hemisphere's anxieties. It wants to measure everything, otherwise it's very anxious. And everything needs to be the same and equal if possible. One aspect of it is not immediately obvious. Its relationship, I mean the relationship of symmetry, with stasis. In mathematics, the term refers not just to symmetry about an axis, which is the way we often think of it, usually think of it, but to any procedure which one can perform on an object and leave it unchanged. It also signifies independence from contingency. In other words, universality. If a law obeys symmetry, it is universally applicable. Newtonian mechanics, though strictly speaking an illusion, obey symmetry. All these meanings ally it with the realm of stasis, of universals, of simple ideal forms, the left hemisphere. And when we come to the Enlightenment, this beautiful building is in fact 16th century, built on Palladian principles, and antedates the Enlightenment, but I'll have a little more to say about Enlightenment later. In architecture, symmetry was prized above all, to excess in my view. Portraits showed largely symmetrical and therefore largely featureless faces, and poetry used to imitate symmetry by having a line that goes in two parts, and then the next line repeats it back and closes it off. So in The Rape of the Lock, here, speaking of one of her council rooms, here thou, great Anna, whom 3 realms obey, dost sometimes counsel take, and sometimes tay. So that's, it has a kind of slightly deflating air. It kind of don't get above yourself. Don't think, you can avoid this kind of clever weaving of reflection and answer, which closes things in and ties them up, rather than opening them up to possibility. It has its own beauty, don't get me wrong. I'm a great admirer of Pope. I think Oscar Wilde said somewhere, there are 2 ways of hating poetry. One is just to hate it, and the other is to like Pope. And I'm afraid he was completely wrong. Pope was a great poet, and so was Dryden. But symmetry was the guiding principle of the Enlightenment. It's simple, it's static, it's perfect. And in the world, everything that is alive is not static and is not universal and is not perfect. So I've referred to stasis in contradistinction to evolution. Symmetry is not in itself generative, opening up to possibility, but closes down to a self-referring state of certainty. But mildly broken symmetry is like another important generative phenomenon, metaphor. The truth of metaphor, you see, depends on an untruth. I'll say that again. The truth of a metaphor depends on an untruth. Churchill was a bulldog. Not a lie, nor a literal truth, but it's the coming together of an equivalence that is denied with one that is asserted, that counts. After all, Churchill was also not a bookcase, but this is not a point that has ever been made, I think, until now. This in turn helps one see that what is needed is both symmetry and asymmetry, themselves an asymmetrical pairing at a higher level. It's neither the breaking of the symmetry alone, nor the symmetry that is broken, but the new breaking in conjunction with the old symmetry, the combination of the two that is generative. Asymmetry is more capacious and more forgiving than symmetry, and can contain its apparent opposite within itself. I think I mentioned yesterday that for something to be called asymmetrical, it has to have at least the makings of being symmetrical. Otherwise, as I say, it's just chaotic. And in a beautiful asymmetry, the symmetry is also contained there, expressed there, and available for cognition at the same time that the asymmetry is. You can't do that with symmetry. Symmetry is much more restrictive. Get an element of asymmetry in and somehow it's lost. Or at least that's the way people think of it. In this, it's rather like the right and left hemispheres, because the right hemisphere already needs and is prepared to include the vision of the left hemisphere. In the myth of the master and his emissary, the master, the right hemisphere, appoints the left hemisphere to go and do certain administrative work on its behalf, so as to relieve it of something that would distract it from its more important task of keeping a wise oversight. And so it has no quarrel with the left hemisphere unless it becomes high and mighty and thinks that it is the master. As long as it's doing its job, it's accepted by the right hemisphere. But the left hemisphere literally doesn't see the need for the right hemisphere, because it doesn't see what it is it doesn't see. And not knowing what it is you don't know is much more dangerous than knowing the things you don't know. So a world which obeyed symmetry only could not exist. That would be the left hemisphere fantasy of stasis and timelessness. So is asymmetry built into the foundations of reality? Well, physicists tell us that if it weren't for the asymmetry, a small asymmetry of antimatter and matter at the moment of the Big Bang, there would have been nothing. So we require an asymmetry at that moment, and it's the condition of the origin of all things. Further than this, Pierre Curie, a great Nobel Prize-winning physicist, wrote in 1894, certain elements of symmetry may coexist with certain phenomena, but they're not necessary. What is necessary is that certain elements of asymmetry exist. It's asymmetry which creates the phenomenon. In fact, he says that it's important that certain elements of symmetry don't exist. Then we come to the laws of conservation. In other words, a certain physical property, a measurable quantity, in other words, doesn't change over time within an isolated physical system. And it was thought that the four fundamental forces in the universe on which physics is based, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong interaction, and the weak interaction, all obeyed parity, that is to say, left-right symmetry. But in fact, in 1956, Chen-Xiong Wu discovered that there was a violation of parity in the case of the weak interaction. In other words, the spins of the particles in the weak interaction have a handedness. In the same way you can't fit your right hand into your left hand's glove, even though they're symmetrical. There is something called chirality in the structure of molecules and in the structure of physical entities. And this chirality is a violation of symmetry in the form of parity. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on talking about physics. It's become apparent from a number of disciplines that dynamic systems depend on what is often expressed as a balance between opposing and complementary forces, between chaos and order, stability and flexibility. The edge of chaos is the most fruitful condition of an open system. And I don't know, probably a lot of you will have read or at least come across Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, in which he suggests that fragility is a better way of surviving than robustness. Robustness is like the oak that stands firm until finally it's completely blown over. But fragility is what the reed has that blows before the wind. And of course, this is the substance of one of Aesop's fables. So make things too robust and they can't survive. They need to have some degree of impairment, if you like, imperfection, as we would think of it, in the exertion of control that allows them to make changes. And I think what is it? Is it the Eurostar jet fighter? I can't remember, but there is a jet fighter that is going so fast that it has to have built into its system a degree of indeterminacy. If it didn't, it wouldn't be unmaneuverable at very high speeds. It would have to go for a very, very long way before it could make a turn. But because there is a deliberate instability built into the system, it is possible to exploit that instability to make a much sharper turn than you would otherwise have been able to make. It's a nice metaphor for many things in life. And I just want to stress again that point I made yesterday, that it's in the nature of opposites that you don't really want a flabby midpoint, but the maximally co-present combination to produce what Heraclitus calls harmonia, that tension in the string that gives the bow and the lyre their virtue. Heraclitus' most famous saying, if he ever said it, everything flows. A lot of what we know of Heraclitus is second-hand, and that happens to be one. But there was also Democritus, who said this interesting thing that the origin of all things is the vortex. And vortices have several asymmetrical components. First of all, they have chirality. They have a handedness to the way they whirl. They express movement upwards or inwards along the axis of the vertex, but they also incorporate circular movement at the same time. So it's the combination of circular movement, which sounds like stasis, with linear movement that achieves moving onward, that causes the way in which a vertex can be generative. I just thought it was worth including a few other nice pictures. This is of a staircase in, I can't remember now where it is exactly, but it's a library here in the United States. Here is my favorite representation of Jacob's ladder. All the other representations I know show a straight ladder like you would get out to mend a tile on the roof. But this is a kind of spiral of progress between heaven and earth. They're connected by a spiral. And as you turn in the spiral, you come back, as it were, to the place you were before, but not in Eliot's sense that you come back and you know it for the first time. You come back at a slightly higher level and look down on where you were previously and know it for the first time. And I just wanted to show you this about the relationship between a particle and a wave, but also that both aspects are already present in the wave. So above you see a particle in schematic form, of course. Below you see a waveform. But if you look down the axis of the waveform, which is the line that goes across the middle of it there, you will see a perfect circle. So the circularity and the onward movement of the flow are present at the same time. and asymmetry is brought in by the vortex, but a degree of symmetry is maintained by the circular motion. I just want to make a few other points about flow. I have a whole chapter on flow in The Matter with Things with some very beautiful illustrations, just show you one or two. But one of the things about it is the sense of reciprocal movement that comes from flow, because we think of flow as being unidirectional, but in fact, within flow, there are streams that even run counter to the flow, so that a dead fish can actually move upstream. If it's in the right place, it can be drawn by countercurrents to go upstream. And it's thought that when trout leap up waterfalls, that they do this by getting into a part of the falling water which has the upward motion that gives them lift. So there is flow, but you see that it has this rather slightly like the yin-yang symbol, isn't it? This sort of the two parts of that coming together, the Taijitu. This was something that Leonardo observed, and here he was observing the patterns made in water by an old man whose stick was there, and it looks like braided hair, the flow in the water that you see on the right side of the paper. These were taken in a lab, I think, in the 70s. The point here is that they show disturbance in the stream in a channel which had absolutely parallel sides and a steady rate of flow and just a rake of rods going down, absolutely symmetrical rods just going down into the water. And they give rise to something you would never have seen in the rods or the channel, which are entirely rectilinear, entirely barren, if you like. And you get this fertile production of patterns that you don't anticipate. At least I don't anticipate. And ultimately, they give rise to a shape like this very frequently, which is called a Kalman vortex street. And it's extraordinarily beautiful. It shows elements of symmetry and asymmetry. It shows how complexity can come out of a very simple disturbance in something that seems rectilinear. And these things don't just exist in ideal situations in laboratories. Here's one off, I think, the coast of Baja California, and that's in water. And here's a rather wonderful one, a meteorological one in cloud formations. You see this street of vortices that have this rather beautiful sort of Art Nouveau-like structure. So what about asymmetry and life? Louis Pasteur, I'm sure you all know who I mean, great microbiologist who gave his name to pasteurization, wrote, "Life as manifested to us is a function of the asymmetry of the universe. I can even imagine that all living species are primordially, in their structure, in their external forms, functions of cosmic asymmetry. Also, I'd add their internal forms. In fact, asymmetry in the human body is much more obvious. There are subtle asymmetries externally usually, but most of them are internal." An interesting point is that symmetry actually never occurs in the phenomenal world. Approximations to it can be made by some living things, which on closer inspection are, however, like the brain, not truly symmetrical and are constantly moving and changing. This is also true of, say, rhythms in nature. I was very struck when I was doing my training on the wards and was attached to obstetrics and gynecology. And on the obstetric ward, if the fetal heart is regular, this is a medical emergency. You must call for help immediately because the baby is distressed. The normal heartbeat is asymmetric, quite remarkably so if you measure it, and that's perfectly healthy. So you need a degree of regularity. Obviously, you need the beats to follow in a certain pattern, but you need a degree of irregularity with it. Division and union, symmetry and asymmetry. In this, again, it's like music. If you think of the Bach, what we heard was harmony, of course, But harmonies also incorporate disharmonies, and Bach was an expert in this, so he often made people play discords, but you don't experience them as painful. You experience them as passing into a resolution, which is all the more beautiful. We also heard counterpoint, another one line and another one answering it, and so forth. So again, there is a symmetry and an asymmetry. And we find this also in the movement, in the flow. I referred to yesterday rubato, this movement which shows the flexibility in the beat, very like, in fact, the heart. And so here you need both structure and its transcendence at the same time. Symmetry breaking turns out to be very important in biology, and here I'm quoting from a well-known paper by Lee and Bowerman. Examples of symmetry breaking in biology abound because it is fundamental to every physiological process. In fact, it may be argued that all qualitative cellular transitions and cellular decision-making are forms of symmetry breaking, especially in the context of asymmetric divisions that lead to different cell fates. Morphogenesis at the single cell level or in multicellular structures, and cell motility. In all these areas you see, and these are the common ways in which cells are engaged in action, you see this symmetry breaking. So, for example, stem cells are undifferentiated. You know, they can give rise to any cell if called on to do so. And often when they divide to renew themselves, as well as giving rise to more specialized cell types, many cases exist in which one daughter cell maintains the stem cell characteristic while the other daughter is differentiated. Now, this principle of symmetry breaking is found everywhere in nature. And I just want to refer, because it's particularly interesting, I think, to something called the golden section. You probably again know this, the golden ratio, which approximates to 1.618. I say it approximates because it's what's called, mathematically speaking, an irrational number like pi and the square root of 2, that you can never reach an end to them. You can repeat, as it were, the process, but there will be no end to it. This doesn't mean, of course, that we don't get anywhere near it. We get very, very near it for all purposes. But fascinatingly, it is never actually concluded. And it is fundamentally asymmetric. So it has these properties that, as you see, there is an enlargement that goes on as you go round the spiral of this very beautiful shell. And it is based on an asymmetry between the rectangles here, A and B, in which the ratio of B to A is the same as the ratio of A to A plus B, and so on. So this is a generative process that goes on infinitely. Symmetry is static, whereas the asymmetry of the golden ratio is generative, and yet pleasingly unifying, with the part and the whole in the same relation. And famously, phi, as it's called, the Greek letter phi, is important for the appreciation of beauty. This has been disputed, but I'm afraid I fairly conclusively dispute the disputers in my written work. So we see these patterns, the smaller within the greater, reflected at each stage. Do you remember me saying yesterday that what is a part at one level is a whole at the next level, and so forth? It's this nested nature of what Koestler called a holarchy that is part of the structure of life. And it's there in the growth of leaves, because the golden section, the golden ratio, is a way of expressing the Fibonacci series of numbers. 1, add 1 to 1, you get 2. Add 1 to 2, you get 3. Add 2 to 3, you get 5. Add 5 to 3, you get 8, and so on. And these numbers have a special relationship. And they're everywhere in nature. This is a schematic idea of the growth of a plant with branches or leaves at different levels, and you see how they go according to the, I wouldn't say dictates, but according to the recommendations of the Fibonacci numbers. And here, what's interesting is this is a plant viewed from above, and these leaves are spiral, and they're spaced in such a way that by using phi, they maximally allow exposure of leaves. If you imagine that leaves were at every level on top of one another, and there are very ancient plants that have this structure, and you've probably seen them in gardens, they're not terribly efficient from a point of view of getting daylight to leaves, especially in places where sunlight is at a premium. And so generally nature has adopted a position of moving things around in this way so that everything gets, as it were, its moment in the sun. And you see this also in a humble object as a pine cone. So here there are spirals in this pine cone, and they are not symmetrical. So one of them has fewer than the other, but they are in the Fibonacci series, in the relationship between them. So does the structure of a sunflower. It looks like the corona of the sunflower is probably symmetrical, but it isn't. If you do actually count those spirals, you will find they are asymmetrical in terms of the right turning and the left turning spirals. But the asymmetry is exactly in proportion with the Fibonacci series. And I did count them so that you don't have to, and they really do follow that pattern. Asymmetry is also even more closely related to generation in nature, and you probably have all seen something like this. This shows the sex chromosomes, which in the male are asymmetrical and in the female are symmetrical, but together they create an asymmetrical pair, and because of that, the whole process of the development of a new life can take place. And in some ways, the symbol, the famous Chinese symbol of the Taijitu, showing yin and yang, has some features that are really important for the things I'm talking about. So, for example, there is a little bit of yang in the yin and a little bit of yin in the yang. So they're both unified and to some extent differentiated. And they are, in one sense, symmetrical, but they're not a reflection of one another exactly. The idea is based on the sunny side and the shadowed side of a hill. And the two sides are, in that sense, asymmetrical. And this asymmetry is more obvious in the Inyo symbol, which is the Japanese equivalent, in which the asymmetry of yang, which is the red blob, which is smaller, and inside the enveloping yin is an important part of what our attention is being drawn to. And then I want to carry on from the idea of that generative aspect in nature to asymmetry in the nervous system, because the nervous system is the thing that generates our world, the world that we experience, our phenomenological reality. And what I didn't show yesterday is that the brain is not only divided, but is also asymmetrical. Now, what you see here is you're looking at the brain from as if you were lying and looking up the spinal column and looking at the base of the brain. And somebody once said to me, "What's that white button in the middle?" But your brain doesn't have a white button in the middle. That's the top of the brain stem where the brain has been cut off, as it were. And it may not be immediately obvious, but the brain at the back on the right side, which is helpfully really the left in life, anatomists and radiologists I'm sure the British must have invented it, it's so counterintuitive, that the right side is actually on the left and the left side is on the right. On the right side of this picture, towards the back, the left hemisphere, you can see, is expanded in greater extent in its breadth, but also pushes further backwards and to some degree even overlaps the midline. And that was very much talked about in medical school because it was said to do with language, and language is the all-important thing about the human ape. But actually this isn't what gives the expansion there, because great apes also have it. And great apes have been taught to use language, and really they cannot. I mean, the closest they can get is to use certain symbols, and they can recognize certain words. I think Washoe was able to recognize about 300 human words, but you have a vocabulary of 70,000 on average, so we're not really talking about the same thing at all. No, what actually that expansion is about is concept formation, which in humans is the basis for language. But nobody mentioned in medical school that there was a much more dramatic asymmetry, which is in the frontal lobes. And if you look at the top, in other words, of the picture, on the left, which remember is the right hemisphere, you can see that the frontal part of the right hemisphere is broader than the left, and also in this picture pushes forward and slightly crosses the midline the way that it does at the back. In other words, it's as though somebody got hold of the brain from underneath and gave it a twist clockwise, and that is called Yakovlevian torque, after the person who first described it. Torque meaning twisting. What is that about? Well, actually it's about really the most important things that make humans what they are. We have been described by Bentham as the tool-making animal, favouring the left hemisphere. But we were also described a long time before by Aristotle as zoon politikon, which doesn't mean the political animal, it means the social animal, because polis was the city. And being the social creatures that we are has depended on the evolving of brain areas that are very good at both empathizing with another being and understanding their meaning, which may and mostly is implicit. It's not just the words they utter. It's their posture, it's their facial expressions, it's their tone of voice, it's all those things, it's their humor, and when we get on to more extensively interesting, sophisticated language, it's also things like metaphor and poetry and so on. So all these things are more critically dependent on the right frontal cortex than anything else. And it says something about what Oliver Sacks called left hemisphere chauvinism, which is rife in neurology. The left hemisphere is the hero that does all the heavy lifting, and the right hemisphere is really coming along for a free ride. But I think I've been able to demonstrate fairly conclusively that the heavy lifting is really done by the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere has got pretensions and delusions of grandeur. So there is the brain asymmetrical, and here, of course, is another brain scan. Actually, no, it's not. It's a very ancient sea creature called Nematostella vectensis. The name means living off the Isle of Wight, which actually is where you do find it. And it's 700 million years old and only slightly bumps up the average of the local inhabitants. Anyway, Nematostella vectensis has been described by Thomas Holstein, who investigated its neural net, as the foundation of the future mammalian brain. And look at it. The axis runs from the left side to the right side of the screen, and across that axis you can see that the neurons are already asymmetrical. Exactly the meaning of that asymmetry is not necessary for me to go into now, but it makes the point that already the two halves, if you like, the left and the right of this animal along its axis, are neurologically different. So asymmetry is present at the very start of the central nervous system. Two signal paths run at right angles to one another, thereby creating an asymmetrical pattern of neuronal cell types. And a very distinguished British psychiatrist, now I think pretty elderly, but who I knew and had the privilege to work a little with, Tim Crowe, an acknowledged expert on schizophrenia, has this to say: except in the light of lateralization, nothing in human psychology or psychiatry makes any sense. Now that's a pretty remarkable statement. So next time you hear people say, oh, there's no difference between the hemispheres, that's all poppycock, that's all been blown out of the water, just tell them they haven't caught up yet. And here is Onur Günterkun, who is at Bochum University in Germany, of Turkish origin, and he won the most distinguished prize in Germany for science research, the Leibniz Prize, for his work on lateralization. And he has this to say: hemispheric asymmetries pervade practically all major neural systems of the human brain. There is hardly any perceptual, cognitive, or motor system that is not affected by left-right differences of at least some of its components. So there again, I would say be careful to dismiss this idea that it's pretty important in nervous systems of all creatures. The nematode worm, Caenorhabditis elegans, with a nervous system that consists of just 302 neurons, already expresses chemoreceptors with left-right differences. This asymmetry enables the worm to discriminate the sensory cues. The slug, Limax, we're talking basic life here, memorizes food odors asymmetrically in its procerebral brain divisions. And honeybees also show left-right asymmetries in odor-driven sensory processing, behavior, and neural representation. And these are just a few examples of the dozens of different invertebrate and vertebrate species that demonstrate asymmetries of function and behavior in the animal kingdom. I'm quoting there Günterkun again. There is a saying, asymmetry pays, and there are hosts of examples from, for example, pigeons, chimpanzees, to humans, linked to intelligence, flexibility, and its relative insusceptibility to psychosis. So asymmetry is very important. Pigeons with stronger visual asymmetry were more successful when foraging for grain scattered among pebbles. Similarly, individuals with pronounced language lateralization have higher verbal IQs and better reading skills. So when we come to the theory that I've been propounding for 30 years, the hemisphere theory, and of course I'm not alone in this, I'm part of an endeavor and standing on the shoulders of giants, but let us accept that there is a theory that is grudgingly being accepted in the face of massive evidence that actually there is asymmetry in the nervous system that has meaning. And I've already discussed the asymmetry in the brain and its relation to human meaning in the last lecture, where I went through the basics of the differences between the two hemispheres. And its extent is a matter not of what, but of how things are done. It's not, as people used to say, that the left processes, as we wonderfully put it, as though we're dealing with a dishwasher. They processes language and reason, and the right hemisphere processes visuospatial information and emotion. These are absolutely unreal. It's not the what, because both hemispheres are involved in everything. It's the how. And this comes from attention, and attention changes the world. Birds and animals pay different attention using the two sides of the brain. I think I probably talked about this yesterday. I won't say much more about it, but I just want to underline that how you attend to something changes what you find there. And if you are not expecting to see something, the most obvious thing in the picture will elude you. I talked to some of you about the well-known film, and now very celebrated film, called Gorillas in Our Midst, which is a film in which you are asked to count a ball as it's passed from a team wearing dark shirts to a team wearing white shirts, and at the end the answer is 14 or something. Did anybody get anything else? No, pretty much about 14, 15 maybe. And then the question is, so what about the gorilla? And you go to gorilla? And then you look again, they play the film again, and you simply can't believe you didn't see it, because a grotesque figure in a gorilla suit walks slowly into the middle of the melee, stands facing the camera, dances a little jig, beats its chest, and then walks nonchalantly off out the other side. But because you were not expecting to see that, your attention was grabbed by something else. You just didn't see it. Now, the importance of that is that basically skills respond to being used. And skills that are not used wither away. And there are cultures in which people have apparently the ability to perceive things we think they can't possibly perceive. They may hear the voice of somebody that's 100 miles away, speaking something to them that makes sense. In fact, in the part of Scotland where I live, there's something called second sight, which is an attested phenomenon in which people can see situations at a distance that are later confirmed, usually involving something fairly dramatic, somebody who's dying or something of the kind. And I did a podcast on the radio with Soil and Soul, Alistair, forgotten his name now, terrible. But anyway, he grew up in the Outer Isles, grew up on I think Lewis, and had many accounts, including in his own life, of second sight. So if this is real, and if people, the Aboriginal people in Australia, think that they can see and hear and do things, hear the voices of the ancestors, a very common thing that is held in most communities, how do we know that they don't? It's not really good enough just to sort of smile at them as though they're childishly ignorant. They may be experiencing something we have stopped being able to experience. And it's drummed out of children when they're little. You know, parents say sort of, no, don't make up stories like that. That's not real. Come and have your Weetabix, or, you know. So we kind of patronize children so that they feel it's not smart. And I can't resist an aside on religious belief here, because you know Dawkins goes on about how children would never have these ridiculously irrational views about there being a divine element to existence if they hadn't been brainwashed into it. And how dare you, he says, sometimes in capital letters, how dare you inculcate these crazy ideas in children. But the evidence is, and it's good evidence, that children naturally see things this way. They naturally talk in terms of things that we think of as part of a spiritual or even a supernatural kind of existence. And it's the exact opposite of Dawkins. It's only when they discover that this is not smart, when they get to school, they're sort of told that, no, this is not how clever people think, that they lose that. Now, in case this idea of attention sounds a little bit rarefied, just some drawings here, researched by Nikolai Nikolaenko in Russia, obviously. And he asked people to draw things first in the state in which they were intact, then in the state in which one or other hemisphere was suppressed temporarily, and then when the contralateral hemisphere was suppressed. And the first one here you see is a tree, according to the intact brain on the left. In the middle, you see the left hemisphere's brain, and it's only interested in the bit on the right, which is the bit where it's catching things with the, you know. So as far as it's concerned, the tree has only a right side. And this is a common phenomenon in people who have right hemisphere damage. They get a kind of blindness to the left side of reality, and will not even notice people if they're standing in front of them on the left. They're not actually blind. There's nothing wrong with the visual pathways at all. It's an attentional deficit. And then on the right, you see this is the right hemisphere's tree, which is, if anything, rather more lively than the one that was first drawn. And here you see the same thing basically with flowers, where the flowers on the right look like growing organisms, the ones in the middle look like reduced geometrical constructs. I just chucked this one in because this is from patients before and after commissurotomy, before and after the operation in which the hemispheres are divided. And on the top, you see an attempt by the left hand and by the right hand to draw a cube, and pretty good in both hands. And afterwards, it's only the left hand, which is the one that is controlled by the right hemisphere, that is able to draw something that still looks like a cube. But the hand that's been drawing cubes all its life constructs, it has no sense of three-dimensionality. I think I may have mentioned this, no sense of depth. And so it draws a flattened out structure. And just a word on depth. Depth is a very important thing in life in very many ways. And the right hemisphere has greater depth in space than the left hemisphere. Literally, people lose 3D vision with loss of the right hemisphere's input, and they see everything as projected two-dimensionally on a screen. And sometimes they say, I feel as though I could put my hand up and pull the corner of the screen down. So it's flattened out space. But it does the same thing to time. So time becomes little slices of time and is no longer the continuous flow of time that has depth, the time that was before, that made us who we are, the time that will come after as we go on living and acting, and even after we die. So it has less depth in those senses, but it also has less depth in emotion. So there are certain superficial emotions, social emotions, like going through the ability to express things at a cocktail party, which the left hemisphere can do, but the deeper emotions are ones that, if you like, depend much more heavily on the right hemisphere. And I'd go even further and say that depth of insight, imaginative understanding is much more dependent on the right hemisphere. But all this I have written about. Now, so we've talked about various things. We've talked about asymmetry in general as the foundation of life. We've talked about asymmetry in nature, about asymmetry in the central nervous system, about the hemispheres. But what about some rather basic things to do with existence and beauty? So aesthetics and ontology. Does asymmetry come up here? Well, we've looked at one thing. We've looked at the golden section, in which there is asymmetry with symmetry. But there is also asymmetry in handmade artifacts, which makes them more beautiful. These are Japanese ceramics that display something called the wabi-sabi aesthetic, which is that of something that is sort of imperfect by the left hemisphere standards, but actually more beautiful for its evocation of something that is living and has come from a living hand. And in there you will also see some examples of kintsugi, which I showed you yesterday, the vase that gets repaired with strands that are gold-filled and bring a new beauty to the thing that it had not before it was fractured, broken. Here's the front of probably the most famous cathedral in the world, Chartres Cathedral. And through an accident of history, it does have this profoundly asymmetrical facade. There is a kind of symmetry implied, as I say, in asymmetry, so it has the combination of symmetry and asymmetry. But although it could be seen as an imperfection, I think it makes this facade more beautiful and more lively than any other cathedral facade I know. Then let's think about mental constructs, going back here to the 15th century. The idea of the ideal city, so something that's already rather disembodied and out of this world. But by this point in history, in the 15th century, the interest in the actual, the concrete, the real, was as great as the interest in the ideal. And so you see in these pictures, there are elements of them that are fundamentally, broadly speaking, symmetrical, but also asymmetrical. I've put the names of the artists underneath. Here's another one, and finally this one. You see in each case, although it's proposing an ideal, that ideal is subtly asymmetrical in the way that combines symmetry with asymmetry. And here is another very famous work of art, Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican stanze. But there is representation here. The idea is to represent Plato and Aristotle in the middle of the picture there, debating. Plato is pointing upwards to the realm of the ideas, which is the only reality, and Aristotle is saying, no, but here also matters. And then there are all sorts of other philosophical, historical figures. And by the way, Raphael was 26, I think, when he painted this. 26? And in the picture there, I just want to draw your attention to one figure, which is thought to be a portrait of Michelangelo. Can you see a figure leaning on his elbow, looking rather sort of perplexed? This is Heraclitus. as modelled, as it were, by Michelangelo. And Raphael himself is in the picture on the right side there. He looks like a very beautiful young man with long hair. But here you've got a philosophical expression that is also an aesthetic expression that combines apparent symmetry with a very important asymmetry. This is, for me, interesting. I include these illustrations in The Matter with Things. And the first is a villa called La Rotonda, which is in northern Italy, near Vicenza, I think. And it's designed by Palladio, who, of course, was probably acknowledged to be the greatest architect of the era. And you see here that there is a symmetrical building with a symmetrical portico and so on. But what's this that's going on? There are figures that are not rigid, but are in movement, that are standing on the pediment, apparently, and also further forward in the picture. And they include men and women. And in the middle, there is an animal on the shield there. In fact, it's a goat, because the family that commissioned it were called Capra, and Capra is Italian for a goat. So you've got these living figures, human figures, diverse human figures, and an animal in motion, counterpointing the beautiful lines of the geometry of the structure. Now, Palladio was an important influence on architecture right through to the 18th century and to the 19th century. In Savannah, as you go around, you can see buildings that are effectively based on the designs that Palladio made popular. And here you see one such building, not, of course, from Savannah, but from the University of Virginia, which was Jefferson's homage to Palladio. But if you look at it, you'll see that it is purely symmetrical. And it's very beautiful in a way. I don't wish to deny that. But it also seems to me to lack something when compared with that. And I think it's to do with the fact that there is no asymmetry in this picture. And in the middle, where there had been an animal, there is now a clock measuring the hours. Then, of course, it's not just in Western culture, but in great other cultures, and I particularly think here of the Japanese. I just want to show you some sensationally beautiful Japanese kimonos. In some senses, very simple, but the simplicity is a shield for the ultimate sophistication. So here you have one such. Look at that. So there's symmetry, isn't there, in the form of the kimono, but it plays with asymmetry at the same time. And human artifacts, even ones like this that are repaired, have a kind of accommodation in them that makes them more ready to the hand, more humane than something mass-produced by a machine. Well, what about aesthetics of the face? Appreciation of the human face. Now, the face is normally asymmetric in structure as well as function. So in most people, the left hemiface, their left hemiface, is slightly larger than their right hemiface. And this is because the left hemiface is controlled by the right hemisphere, which is emotionally much more deep than the left hemisphere. And so this part of the face is more expressive, which is why in the Renaissance people started to paint more often than not this side of the face with the portrait sitter looking off slightly to the side, maybe looking at the painter, but with the more expressive hemiface there. And in all cultures, even left-handed people tend to cradle a baby to the left. And this is thought to be because, and men do it as well as women, but it's thought to be because it engages the mother's more expressive left hemiface with the child's gaze. And when the child turns towards the mother or to the mother's breast, the child's more expressive left hemiface, controlled by the right hemisphere, is engaged with the mother's left hemiface. But it's not true, in other words, that the best human faces are symmetrical. It's often been said by people who are interested mainly in insects that no, that's not quite fair, but no, in most of nature, apart from humans, symmetry is a good sign for selecting a mate. And it is actually, because very often a cause of asymmetry may be, if it's a gross asymmetry, may be that there is something that is not standard issue about this particular specimen. And so you want to mate with one that is more standard issue. But let's just have a look at human faces. In the human case, humans appear not to share this preference for symmetry. And even in cases where symmetry is clocked as more healthy, it's still experienced as less attractive. In fact, symmetry in living faces, because it suggests something mechanical and unreal, borders on the uncanny, a perception that lies behind the fearful symmetry of Blake's tiger. So this is Harrison Ford. I chose somebody that I thought probably everyone would recognize, and performed a reflective composition of the face, putting together the two left hemifaces. So here it is symmetrically composed out of the left hemiface and the reflected left hemiface. But here is what happens with the right hemifaces. It's a different person, isn't he? I mean, it's there, but it is very interesting. And here is, I just took this actually from a newspaper, somebody who'd won a prize for the most beautiful girl in the south of England. And there she is. Yes, she is very attractive. But again, it's not based on symmetry. She looks to the fleeting eye as though she is pretty symmetrical. But if you put together, again, first, I think this is the two halves of the face controlled by the left hemisphere, the two right hemifaces. I may have misspoken, actually, on Harrison Ford. I may have mixed my left and right there, but yeah. And here we have a different face, which is the two right hemisphere-controlled left hemifaces looking at one another again. Quite a different sort of person. And there, of course, is Blake's tiger, this symmetrical face that induces a sense of awe or fear. For those of you who don't know Blake's poem, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, I will read it tomorrow for other reasons. And just to show you something about portraiture, in the Renaissance, portraits were often rather beautifully, first of all, individualistic. Some of them were definitely warts and all kind of representations. I'm not going to show you examples. But here, for example, is a very subtle portrait of a woman by, I think, Bronzino. And you can see that it has life, it has character, and it's not a symmetrical looking face. Here is an 18th century, so moving forward 200 and something years, portrait, and it's symmetrical, and it's frankly lifeless. And it reminds me of a remark that Oscar Wilde made about certain kinds of English face, that once seen, they were never remembered. And this is an example of a face that once seen is never remembered. And funnily enough, you find something of the same progression as Rome goes into decline. So if you go on from here, you have a respite in Romanticism, but then by the time you get to the 20th century, you've got faces that are geometric structures that are blatantly not like a human face and often quite distorted. And they're usually looking full-faced, not this oblique glance, which actually conveys something else than this confrontational stare. There's a lot to say about that. Some of it's in The Master and His Emissary. But here, for example, is a face from 60 BC. And it's a remarkable work, the character in this face, and how it is slightly tilted, it is asymmetrical, it is highly expressive. Now, things, of course, get more sophisticated over time, so let's move forward from 60 BC to 400 AD. Not my idea of an improvement. And then even worse, probably, this from roughly the same period, 5th century AD, and a portrait of Theodosius II, the emperor of the Eastern Empire. And he probably could afford to hire a good sculptor, but that's what he looks like. And I have quite a lot to say about this, I think it's in The Master and His Emissary, about the way in which the subtlety of expression and asymmetry and individuality gave way to sort of rigid, staring frontal faces that give away nothing and are basically about hierarchy. I thought it would be worth just talking a little bit about Christ's face. This is, I think, the oldest that we know of for certain face of Christ, and certainly the most famous from its era, which is the 6th century AD, from the monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai. And in it, you can already see that this face is profoundly asymmetrical. The eyes are asymmetrical. The eyebrows are asymmetrical. The nostrils are asymmetrical. The hair is asymmetrical. And this is not because the artist doesn't know how to paint properly, but it is part of a tradition that was growing up, that Christ's face had certain iconographic asymmetries in it, which involve things exactly like the eye, the eyebrow, the cheek, the lip, the nostril. And this is, I think, the comparison of the two parts of the two sort of Christ's right faces together on the left, and Christ's two left faces on the right. Here's another example. That's the two left hemifaces. Those are the right hemisphere's domain. And here are the two right hemifaces, which are the left hemisphere's domain. Can't resist this because I think it's probably the most beautiful artwork in the world. It's in the Church of St. Saviour in Hora in Istanbul. It's been a mosque for a long time. But this mosaic, which is, I think, 12th century, and when I first saw it, I had no idea it was there. I went in the 70s, long before the internet, and I wasn't prepared for this. And I went into the church and was completely bowled over by this thing. It seems to me so deep, so redolent of the knowledge of what is involved in being the Saviour and being his mother. And the relationship between them is almost heartbreaking. But the face is asymmetrical. And if you then do the exercise that I've just shown you, you get those differences. It's not just in Christian art. So here is the pensive Bodhisattva, a very beautiful bronze work, which is obviously asymmetrical in the figure and in the face. And you see it actually more broadly, not just in faces, but in decorative art. Interestingly, in the Roman villas, they painted very lifelike portraits of people, but also painted in 3 dimensions. They painted in perspective. And perspective was lost after the fall of Rome. So it was discovered by the Greeks, and there are stories of, I forget the name of the painter now, but he painted grapes so beautifully and so lifelike that birds would come and try and peck at them. This is the story we're told. And you get a period in which everything that is considered beautiful has this kind of depth to it, and then it is lost. It's then rediscovered in Rome, and is then lost again until it's apparently discovered in about the 14th or 15th century. I think the date that's normally given is 1415 in the Piazza del Duomo in Florence, but I mean, that's being a little bit too precise. But anyway, there we have a picture from the paving of a Roman villa, and it in no way repeats itself anywhere, but has these waves that have the sort of patterns that exist in nature. And finally, the locus classicus within difference, and difference within similarity, is the emanation of the phenomenal universe initiated by a first symmetry breaking, wherein the ground of being, fundamental awareness, began to manifest and perceive the possibility of self and other, moves from a self-reflexive I am to I and thou, or self and the universe. So once again, like division and union, and symmetry and asymmetry are part of the story not only of the physical world, but also of the spiritual and phenomenological world. So I can't resist this quotation from Hegel. He was wonderful at writing impenetrable stuff. Everything, he says, and it makes perfect sense, everything depends on the unity of differentiatedness and non-differentiatedness, or the identity of identity and non-identity. Well, he'd been reading McGilchrist. I mean, I can do it more elegantly, but I mean, no, Hegel's been a great influence for me, and somebody I greatly admire. And probably only he wasted more ink and paper than I have. So everything depends on the asymmetry of symmetry and asymmetry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McGilchrist, for that beautiful lecture. I'm going to open the floor now for a few questions.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. McGilchrist. This is, again, round 2, getting better every day, so thank you very much. The other day when you were at the dinner, you got a chance to meet my little baby daughter. Yeah, and she was born with a cleft lip and palate, and she just recently had her palate repair surgery. And something that I've been thinking about lately is sort of the tendency of the left hemisphere to over-analyze, to hyper-compartmentalize. And I think that it's not too far of a stretch to say that modern medicine, particularly things like surgery, it's kind of an extension of that. Looking at the human body as distinct bits and parts that you can manipulate physically for a desired result. And I was just wondering, do you think that it could have been possible to get modern surgical techniques or other things like understanding of genetics or things that are very specific and compartmentalized without the nosedive too far into the left hemisphere that also gets us things like societal-wide loneliness and the breakdown of religion and things like that? I'd be wondering to hear what you have to say about that.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I hope I've made clear that I think that it is a partnership, just an unequal partnership, between the right and left hemisphere that is required and is most effective. And certainly without the very great powers that the left hemisphere gives us, we wouldn't have achieved many of the things that we have achieved, probably most of them. So it's not that I'm trying to say we would be better off without it, but your question was more specific. Could we have avoided the deep dive so that, as it were, the left hemisphere is taken over? And I think we could, yes. I think that there is humane medicine, and I think that it has been practiced at all times, but that it is in the minority. And I think that other traditions of medicine, I don't want to elevate folk medicine too high. Of course, it has certain wisdoms, and these are often pointed out. But I think it's a brave person, perhaps a foolish person, who would deny the enormous steps forward that have been made through the kind of analytic, rigorous thinking that has gone to make medicine what it is. But it's also drawn very heavily in its best moments on accident, imagination, happenstance, and image, in the same way that all science has. And we need to keep our imaginations alive. And above all, when we're dealing with the human being and the human body, I'm concerned about medicine that lacks that. I've been asked to give the John P. McGovern lecture at Duke, and the idea is the coming together or the necessary combination of science and the humanities. And it's a subject that I feel very strongly about and think is very important. And apparently John P. McGovern left us benefaction because he also thought it was very important. He was trained by Sir William Mosler, who was a Canadian physician who has left his imprint on medical training, indeed on mine as well. And he was a very humane physician who saw the whole person, not just, as it were, a machine in front of him.
Dr. McGilchrist, my lovely wife is not here, and if she was, I probably wouldn't ask this question. I suspect, after listening to you, that she might be left brain dominant, and I might perhaps be right brain dominant. How best can we communicate?
Marriage made in heaven, I would have thought. Vive la différence, as we used to say. I think you can communicate fine. I hope you can. After all, the process of living with somebody, you learn from each other, and I hope that that is a way in which things can go. But I wouldn't really like to comment too much on your particular situation, but it's a nice idea. I mean, I don't really believe that, except in some very, very unusual cases, that people are wholly one thing or the other. I think that's perhaps too simple. But anyway, good luck.
Thank you for your time. So you mentioned yesterday, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the left hemisphere is where optimism is housed. And I'm curious, that as I see it, I think, and again, I may be totally wrong in this, if we get too focused on the specifics, optimism is short-lived. And in my view, looking at the totality of existence, whether it's from a religious perspective, a physics perspective, there seems to be written in the fabric of the universe that out of chaos comes beauty. Out of an exploding and dying star comes a galaxy. And so, to me, it seems to be that a firm grasp with the right hemisphere gives us a more lasting hope, potentially an optimism that is more broadly defined than the left hemisphere. Is that potentially something you may see or agree with?
Yes, I think that the right hemisphere is more realistic, and it's very important if you want to survive to be realistic, not blindly optimistic. It's not as though optimism and happiness are the same thing. Optimism is a cast of mind, which at times is very useful, and it is more characteristic of the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more in touch with suffering humanity and the suffering world altogether, is more empathic, and is therefore more likely to be tinged with a sort of sadness. I think I have a melancholy cast of mind, but I'm generally speaking a pretty happy bloke, because I enjoy life. I think humor helps a great deal, but I think that having a realistic appreciation of where we are is more likely to lead us through this. I sometimes call myself a hopeful pessimist, and that has meaning, because what I mean by the pessimist is that looking around, things don't look terribly good. Although recently, since they've got so much worse, things seem to be getting better again. So, as I said yesterday, so we live in a time that may be a turnaround moment, so that's what I'm putting my money on, and I'm putting my best foot forward until I fall over to do that. And I hope that everyone else here shares that ambition to do the best we can. We should never give up hope. And the limits of our knowledge are a great reason for being hopeful. Our ability to predict the future is extraordinarily poor. Nobel Prize-winning economist, no less, predicted that the economy was now secure at the very moment that it crashed. And we just aren't good at predicting the future. It's a mistake to think you can. So I keep an open mind.
May I ask you, Dr. McGilchrist, just before we move to the next question, or if you would be willing to say a few more words about the relationship between sadness and beauty?
Well, I was lucky enough to be a protege taken under the wing of Professor Alwyn Lischman, who was often considered the father of neuropsychiatry, as it now is. So he wrote a great book called Organic Psychiatry, which is pretty much the Bible in that area. But as well as being an expert on organic psychiatry, he was good on the organ. He was an organist, in fact, and a great music lover. And we were talking about music, and he said, don't you think, Ian, that actually the natural mode of music is, in fact, sadness? And although there are very joyful pieces of music, I think he's right, that they're taking a sort of holiday from sadness, but it's often tinged with sadness. Around where I am, there's a wonderful flourishing of folk music, sometimes sort of fusion folk, which I've nothing against. It actually is very creative and produces some really fabulous music. And I was playing some of this to a friend of mine who lives in Greece, and he was saying, yes, it's very lively and so on, but it's all tinged with sadness in a way. And I think that is right. And Greek folk music, which I also know a bit, and is stunningly beautiful, is also, it always has this sort of slightly melancholy tone to it. And it's this lament, which is being in touch with life. In a way, you cannot be a fully sentient being and empathic with the world and not feel the sadness, not feel the pain. But of course, we have to absorb that into us and find ways of dealing with it. And this is why our ability to create great art, which somehow takes it up and transforms it, is so important. You know, King Lear is this profound tragedy. And we pay money to go and watch this terrifically sad thing because, of course, it doesn't make us sad. It ennobles life. It lifts us up to another level. It enables us to see something new. And so art, along with humor, I really believe humor is so important. I'm lucky enough to be a friend of John Cleese. And I'm always saying to him, John, you know, the comedians, the great comedians, are up there with the poets. And if you think about it, an awful lot of what goes on in good comedy is something like poetry, making connections between things that otherwise you wouldn't have seen, that swiftly change your point of view, and you get an insight into something, and it lifts up your spirits. So I think these are the things that we bring to bear on it. But I think that, you know, it is true that music has this kind of melancholy aspect to it.
You suggested at the beginning that asymmetry is built into matter and antimatter, which gives birth to the universe, if you will, and without it, we wouldn't exist. In your thoughts, have you translated that into virtues and into symmetry and asymmetries and good and evil?
Ooh, yeah, it's a good question, and of course I have. Because in the very last substantive chapter of The Matter with Things, it's a chapter called The Sense of the Sacred. I obviously have to consider, as we all who have a faith of whatever kind have to consider, that if there is indeed a loving God, how is it that there is so much terrible suffering in the world? And I mean, I'm afraid my point of view on that is that there is an asymmetry between good and evil, that good cannot exist without evil because opposites are necessary to one another. And particularly they're necessary to freedom in creation. A creation that was simply a foregone conclusion would be of no use or no purpose. There would have been no point in creating something if God already had it, as it were, and knew the answers to everything. So I don't believe that God is omniscient and omnipotent, but I also don't believe he's not omniscient and not omnipotent. What do I mean by that? The left hemisphere thinks that omniscience means that you know all the facts, as it were. But there is another way of knowing, which is understanding in the sense of recognizing and feeling your way into something. And God has that, but doesn't necessarily know the future. That's my belief. Because in a way, he voluntarily emptied himself of some things in order to make the creation. It's not so explicit in the Christian story as it was in the Kabbalistic story that I told yesterday of the first act of the ground of being to withdraw and remove its power to create a space for there to be something other. But I think having created that other space, there is room for evil in the world. But if you think about it, there's another asymmetry here, because goodness, being love effectively, can embrace evil. But evil, being effectively hatred, cannot embrace good. So good is greater than evil. Good can embrace, take into itself, and transform what is in its nature at the time evil and turn it into something greater. But evil can never do this to good. Which is not to say that people can't become corrupted. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is that evil in general is powerless to overcome the truly good.
What role does the left hemisphere play specifically in the making of art?
It's a faithful servant. So when you want to create art, you need to learn things. You need to learn facts. You need to learn skills. And I'm not saying that's purely left hemispheric. In fact, manual skills and those sort of things, the skill that goes into the hand of the painter or the sculptor or whatever it is more than likely at an unconscious level with which the right hemisphere is more in touch. But in other words, we need to be able to think differently about the creation. We need to plan it in a schematic sense, or at least for many great works of art that would have been necessary. And I don't think that actually just saying to people, well, here's a paintbrush and here's a palette and here's a canvas, just express yourself. Well, maybe a little bit of that, but then we've got to grow up, and that means a little bit of hard work, and it means actually learning skills that will liberate you rather than restrict you. Because if you learn a skill, you know how to do things that otherwise you simply can't do, you can't express. And in the case of music, I sometimes actually use music and the acquisition of music, probably even the writing of music, to explain the difference between the right and left hemispheres and how they cooperate. So it's easy to see in the case of a musician that you think, I really like to play that piece for 2 violins. Thank you, Bach. And so you start playing, but then there are moments when you think, oh, I've got to go and practice this bit over and over again. And you think, oh, I see, well, here we return to the dominant, we've been on an excursion. We return to the tonic, we've been on an excursion into the dominant, or whatever it may be. And so part of your mind is doing some important work of understanding the structure you're confronting and helping you to break it up and achieve fluency. But at the moment of playing, you have to forget all of that, otherwise you'll give a very bad performance. So it wasn't wasted time, it was very important time, but it must remain at an implicit level. If it becomes explicit, then it all fails. There's a very wonderful essay by William Hazlitt on jugglers, and he was saying that it's very important that it appears entirely effortless. If you could see that there was effort involved, it would spoil the effect of the thing. So you mustn't see that they're kind of remembering and think. You must see that they can just do it, and good magicians are like this as well. So that's what I'd say about their contributions to art. They're complementary at different stages in creation. Probably great artists rely more than anything on intuition and imagination. I quote a long account by Mozart about how his ideas come to him, and basically he doesn't know where they come from, but once they come, he has to write them down.
Sir Roger Scruton warned us about the narrowness of neuroscientific explanation as opposed to something like humanistic understanding. And of course, you've stressed the necessity of breadth. And I'm curious how you think about overcoming the limitations of neuroscientific knowing and arriving at an understanding that intersects across disciplines.
I mean, in fact, I think Roger Scruton was slightly anxious about my work to begin with because he thought it might be a reductionist. But of course, it's anti-reductionist. And I think, and I liked him, and we talked about it, and all was fine. But I think the broader question is, yes, how does one keep it in a sort of context whereby it remains humane and fully human? And there's nothing wrong with knowing about the brain and the nervous system. It doesn't have to result in putting that between us and humanity. It can be a way of illuminating humanity. And that's the way in which I see it, that it tells us things that go beyond the mere facts. Now, of course, one of the things is that 1 or 2 very left hemispheric scientists have said, but you go beyond the facts. Well, it depends what you mean by the facts. I mean, I don't know any place in the literature where you've got 6,000 references to the literature backing up the points I make. But going beyond the facts is something that science is always doing and should be doing, because the mere facts are there that what a computer could understand. But we have to actually understand, not just do what a computer processor does. So we need to be able to put these revelations together in a sense that makes sense in the human world. And that's what I believe I've devoted myself to trying to do, taking things from the scientific realm in neuroscience, seeing what their implications are for individuals and for the culture, and elaborating that. Unfortunately, a lot of people have responded to that.
My question is, and this is kind of a follow-up to what you just said, your work seems to appeal to people across many ideological spectrums. In other words, you're bridging gaps, which I think is needed in today's world. Can you speak to that? What do you think about that? Why is that?
If I'm right, since the brain is inevitably involved in everything human that we do, it must apply across the board. It is not just going to apply in one area. And so it has applications and I am only discovering them lately. I mean, I knew it had implications for philosophy, psychiatry, neurology, and things like that. And I thought it probably had implications for things further afield, like the law. A lot of lawyers have become very interested in my work, but also things that I didn't necessarily expect, like economics and politics. And again, politicians and economists have, again, encouraged debate with me and asked me to speak at their conferences and so on. At this stage, they're not my main constituency, but they are part of it, which is very nice. And some, in my country, quite intelligent politicians like Rory Stewart and anyway, others such as David Owen and so on, who are highly intelligent people, have engaged with my work. So I never anticipated this. But also what really pleases me is that you don't have to be an intellectual, as it were, to understand it. A lot of it is very intellectually charged material. But actually I hope that what I'm able to do is to convey the meaning of it so that anyone with a certain degree of intelligence can see what it is I'm getting at. So I'm proudest of the fact that a cleaner in Oxford, actually he might be an unusual cleaner, I have a feeling he's got a doctorate, but a cleaner in Oxford and a long-distance lorry driver in Australia correspond with me about the meaning of my work. It's great.
The final Sophia lecture will take place tomorrow evening, same time and same place. Please join me in thanking Dr. McGilchrist for a wonderful second lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much.